And welcome to ETF Edge, your go-to place for everything exchange-traded funds. I'm your host, Bob Pisani. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit sided with Grayscale in a lawsuit against the SEC, greatly improving the chances that a Bitcoin ETF will be approved. What's next? Let's ask Matt Hogan. He's the Chief Investment Officer for Bitwise Asset Management. He's one of the 9 applicants seeking approval for a Bitcoin ETF from the SEC. Craig Salmon's the Chief Legal Officer for Grayscale, which brought the suit. And Jeremy Senderowitz is an attorney with Vedder Price, who has been representing ETFs for close to 20 years. Craig, I want to start with you. I know you were personally involved in this case. You're the Chief Legal Officer for Grayscale. It was a unanimous decision. How are you feeling? How's Grayscale doing?
Yeah, so first, Bob, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. We're feeling very, very good about the outcome of this case. Yesterday, a panel of 3 judges ruled by unanimous consent in Grayscale's favor. It's a win for us, it's a win for our shareholders, and it's a win for the whole crypto community. But just taking a step back, this is really a culmination of something that started back in 2013 when we first launched GBTC, ultimately with the intention of eventually converting it into an ETF when permitted by the regulatory environment. Fast forward, we refiled this application to convert into an ETF on the same day the first Bitcoin futures ETF started trading. The reason why we did that is because we took the view that if the commission is okay with Bitcoin futures, which are derivatives of physical spot Bitcoin, which is in GBTC, they must also be okay with spot Bitcoin ETFs. Unfortunately, we were denied the following June, and so again, that very same day, we filed this lawsuit. Yesterday represents the culmination of all of that work with this 3-judge panel ruling in our favor. So it's great progress for our ETF efforts and a really positive step forward.
And the court agreed with you. Essentially, they said Bitcoin futures, Bitcoin spot, like products.
Right.
You prove one, you have to prove the other. Matt, it seems like the ball's in the SEC's court right now. Game this out for us. What happens next?
Yeah, I do think the ball's in the SEC's court. I think Grayscale did a great job taking this to court, making convincing arguments. And what it means is that the SEC can no longer deny spot Bitcoin ETFs on these concerns around market manipulation and surveillance. It had already blessed Bitcoin futures ETFs. Those track the spot price of Bitcoin. So it has to allow spot Bitcoin ETFs under that standard. Now, there are other requirements in place, and the SEC and issuers like Grayscale and Bitwise and BlackRock will go forward and discuss those other issues with the SEC. But I'm pretty optimistic that this was a major step forward for the industry, a major win for investors, and puts us hopefully on the path to seeing a spot Bitcoin ETF launch here in the U.S. sometime in the coming months.
Jeremy, I read the ruling, and given how harsh is the word I would say the ruling was, it would seem there's a fairly high barrier for an appeal. I mean, what grounds could they appeal on? The court said Bitcoin futures and Bitcoin Cash are fundamentally similar products. You approve one, you have to approve the other. It seems unlikely that an appellate court would reverse that. But you're the lawyer here. What other arguments could they make if they wanted to appeal?
Yeah, well, it's tough to say. I didn't see in the ruling any obvious grounds on which on which the Supreme Court or the full D.C. Circuit could seize upon to overrule it. In addition to the resounding nature of the decision itself, it also helps the fact that the 3-judge panel that heard it was a fairly diverse panel in terms of politics and background. So there isn't an obvious partisan slant or bias that someone could point to as potential grounds for appeal. It's always possible that the SEC could argue that the court didn't properly credit the SEC's discretion that they're entitled to exercise both under the statute and under relevant precedents that are still in effect governing the Administrative Procedures Act. But I agree with you that based on both the lineup of judges and the evidence presented by Grayscale and affirmed by the court, it looks like it would be a high bar.
Yeah. I don't want to put you on the spot, argue the other side here, but what grounds for appeal would there be? I mean, you're the lawyer. I know you're representing Grayscale here, but
I've been through the opinion many times. I have to say it was essentially the best possible opinion that we could have gotten. The court really leaned into the common sense and compelling legal arguments we've had, which is that futures and spot for all regulatory purposes, for all ETF purposes, are essentially the same. So you have to treat them the same. I think it's a very clear argument to understand intuitively. We also gave quantitative analysis from Professor Bob Whaley, who is the inventor of the VIX index.
Yeah, I know.
He did a years-long study showing that futures and spot were 99.9% correlated, which is to say they are the same for ETF purposes.
I wonder if they're regretting the decision to approve Bitcoin futures, because that was the mistake, if you want to call it a mistake, that they made. I mean, once they committed to that, as the court pointed, they were essentially committed to the concept.
I would not call that a mistake at all. That is good for
not,
investors.
But
it's good for the Bitcoin
people
community.
At the SEC who think that this is a mistake.
I don't think so. I think they saw a reason why they were able to get comfortable with Bitcoin futures. They trade on the CME. They saw the surveillance that takes place there and feel that can account for things like fraud or manipulation. Our view is that that surveillance can also account for any concerns in the underlying spot Bitcoin markets. We got to an impasse with the SEC. It was a professional disagreement. We chose to, pursue this in litigation, which was not an easy decision to make. It's not something we take lightly just to our regulator, but it was something we felt we had to do on behalf of our investors.
Well, you moved the ball forward, and it turned out to be expensive.
Yeah, yesterday the court agreed with us. I will say, though, it's not technically back in the SEC's court today. Under the federal rules of appellate procedure, there is a 45-day window where they can appeal the decision, and so we just have to wait that out and respect that process.
Well, but so let me take the other side of this, Matt. If the SEC chooses not to appeal, what kind of time frame are we looking at to get these to the market? And there seems to be a consensus that if the SEC approves a Bitcoin ETF, they should approve all of them at once. Matt and Craig, maybe you can both agree on that. I mean, does everybody at least agree on that? And give us a time frame. Time that's assuming there's no appeal.
Yeah, I think lining up multiple products to launch at the same time would be the best possible outcome for investors. Create a competitive field. You would likely see the lowest prices and the best quality products. So I'm hopeful that that's the outcome we see, but of course we don't know that. In terms of the timeline, these 33 Act Bitcoin ETFs move on a very specific regulatory timeline with deadlines for review. The next deadline that is up is actually at the end of this week for the Bitwise application, but the SEC could delay that review for another 45 days. Ultimately, the calendar ends and a decision needs to be made sometime toward the end of the year or early next year. But we don't know what's going to happen, Bob. But that's the window you're looking at. Sometime in the next, let's say, 5 or 6 months, we should see significant progress.
Do you agree with that? I mean, assuming there's no appeal.
Yes, I mean, I'm focused on GBTC. Our circumstance is unique in that we have an actual fund today with billions of dollars of AUM. It's trading tens of hundreds of millions of dollars in daily volume. It represents nearly 1 million investors across all 50 states, all wanting it to be an ETF. So the stakes are just a lot higher for us, and that's what we're really focused on right now, getting this over the finish line and converting GBTC into an ETF.
Jeremy, could the SEC come up with some kind of new rationale out of nowhere about why this application should not be approved and then dare Grayscale to sue them again? So, I mean, we know they can't use this argument that there is not a market of sufficient size to prevent manipulation. OK, that's gone. But are there any other arguments they could come up with?
It's certainly possible they could come up with something, and I certainly don't want to give the SEC too many creative ideas about where they other ways they could possibly attempt to reject these filings. But for the last several years, the SEC really has put all its eggs in this basket of that was rejected by the court yesterday. So it will, I think, be pretty difficult to make a compelling argument that all of a sudden there's a new issue that they haven't focused on in these denials for several years, but are important enough to continue denying these applications.
Matt, there is one other possibility here, and it's sort of a scorched earth possibility. The SEC could just kill the Bitcoin futures ETF, right? I mean, is there anything that would prevent them from doing that? I don't think that's going to happen, but they could say, well, we made a mistake and kill it. Is that a possibility at all?
I think that's highly unlikely for two reasons. Yeah. One, I don't think we have any example in the historical literature of that happening. And the other thing is that ETFs are good for investors. People want access to Bitcoin. They're buying it in a variety of ways, including unregulated ways. An ETF would just make it safer cheaper, more efficient, and add regulatory protections to help investors get the exposure that they're going to get anyway. So I think that would be a step backwards for investor protection. And I don't think that's what the SEC is trying to do. They've been careful and cautious about reviewing Bitcoin ETFs for the last 10 years. Early on, the market really wasn't ready for a spot Bitcoin ETF. I think the argument we and others are making is now we are, and I think that's still the likely path forward.
Craig, I want to just switch gears a little, talk about these applications have surveillance sharing agreements with the exchanges that would allow for sharing of information about market trading activity, about clearing activity, and about customer identification. And there's also ways to ensure investor assets can't be diverted by an exchange to an unauthorized party. And I know that was an issue with FTX. Is that enough to reduce concerns about market manipulation? Because these concerns about market manipulation haven't gone away because of this ruling, but address that issue about the surveillance sharing.
Yeah, so I mean, on the concern, any concern you might have about the underlying Bitcoin market structure, that is an identical concern for the Bitcoin futures. So it's just inconsistent to be okay with futures, but not spot. And in terms of surveillance, this was in our 19B4, it was in our lawsuit, it was in the court's opinion yesterday. We all agree that the surveillance on the CME that has oversight over Bitcoin futures is sufficient to account for surveillance in the underlying Bitcoin market structure, which is what would price directly in these ETFs. So we already have surveillance sharing agreements. It's with the CME. I think having more surveillance sharing agreements with exchanges like Coinbase is definitely another positive step forward, but it's not a need to have in this Bitcoin ETF context.
Yeah. Meantime, Matt, these Bitcoin futures are doing well ever since BlackRock said they were going to go in here. I was talking to ProShares yesterday. Their Bitcoin strategy ETF, the original one, BITO, just passed $1 billion in assets. So this is definitely stirring up some interest.
Absolutely. Look, you have the world's largest asset manager saying Bitcoin is going to be an investment that many institutional investors want to make for the foreseeable future. That is a huge endorsement. Our view at Bitwise is we've entered or are entering the mainstream era of crypto, where it goes from being a niche asset to a mainstream asset. ETF Progress is one example of that. BlackRock is one example of that. And people levering or moving into those Bitcoin futures ETFs is an example of investors trying to get in ahead of that trade. If you think it is going mainstream, then it's an attractive asset in many ways, even today.
Craig, what is the future for Grayscale here? I mean, I wonder how much of good news here. Now, you charge 2% right now for the Bitcoin fund. I don't think you're going to be able to charge 2% once it goes into a Bitcoin ETF. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but you're likely going to have 8 other competitors out there. I mean, how do you feel about all the competition now? And are you going to reduce the fees?
Yeah, so we've actually been very public about that for over a year now. We are going to reduce the fee for GBTC upon ETF conversion. But right now, we do have this time period where we have to honor the court's process, await this 45-day clock, and then we are otherwise very focused on actively and constructively re-engaging with the SEC to get this over the finish line.
Jeremy, give us a 30,000-foot view of the SEC and how they came out of this. Was their reputation damaged at all here? I mean, I'm thinking about a larger issue about their ability to create rules and regulation. Was there anything broad that you can come away from this that say, well, the court has reduced the power of the SEC, or did they just make a simple legal error here?
Okay. Well, I think in this particular case, there's an argument that the facts lined up really badly against the SEC, such that the court was able to rule against the SEC without necessarily casting aspersions on the SEC's larger regulatory agenda, whether in crypto or other areas of the financial industry. That said, I think it is noteworthy that the court did feel that the SEC exceeded its bounds so dramatically in this particular case, and at the very least, it signals that the appeals courts are not necessarily going to be deferential to whatever rulemaking or other activities the SEC might undertake. So while this doesn't have direct precedent effect with respect to any of the other potentially controversial activities the SEC might be undertaking, it does serve notice that the courts will be watching.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. That magic phrase, arbitrary and capricious, which is, I guess, part of the Administrative Procedure Act, was the key thing to focus on here. I'm going to have to leave it there, folks. This has been a fascinating conversation and a great week overall for the ETF business. That does it for this week's ETF Edge. My thanks to Matt, Craig, and Jeremy. We've asked Matt to stick around and offer a few more observations on the Bitcoin and ETF market for the ETF Edge podcast that's coming up. And remember, you can see all of our shows on our website, every one of them, all 5 years, etfedge.cnbc.com. Everybody have a healthy, happy, and safe trading week.
Get the ABCs of ETFs with the ETF Edge newsletter. Your weekly update on the hottest trends, expert analysis, actionable ideas, and exclusive insight from host Bob Pisani. Sign up now at cnbc.com/ETF Edge newsletter.